today are me. I am John Furlow. I'm with USAID. I work on adaptation at USAID. Then we're going to have Glenn Anderson, who is with Abt Associates, followed by Glenn and I will each give a little introduction of what we mean by climate services. Glenn has done a lot of work on ways of valuing climate services. Then Jim Beiser and Tauhid Rahman from the University of Arizona will talk about an economic valuation of a climate service project that USAID worked on with the Jamaica Meteorological Service and the Ag Extension Service in Jamaica. And then finally, Chris Bessenecker and Jennifer Wagaman are going to talk about an interesting program of getting geospatial information to herders in Ethiopia and Tanzania. And there they are. And then we've got, hopefully we're going to have plenty of time for questions. Those of you online, please type your questions in. And those of you in the room, you can just raise your hands. So I'm going to talk about the learning objectives. So we hope that you'll come away with a better understanding why climate services are important, why it's worthwhile to invest in climate services, and a few approaches to valuing climate services. And then we're going to give you some specific examples so that you can sort of judge for yourself whether an investment in providing climate information for a variety of different decision makers is a worthwhile investment. As I said, I'm John Furlow. I'm with USAID. And I want to give a little bit of background to the first economic valuation that we're going to have, because it started with some work that I was doing in Jamaica. USAID got involved with the Jamaican government, helping them write a national climate policy that looked at both adaptation and mitigation. And we walked about 150 stakeholders from government and outside of government through a process of looking at their national development priorities and where climate change and climate variability might disrupt progress toward their national development goals, particularly in key economic sectors like tourism and agriculture. And in each of the working groups looking at these economic sectors, they kept coming up with a common problem, and that was a lack of useful information on what was happening with the weather and the climate. And so we worked with the Jamaica Met Service and a number of their potential clients to identify a good starting point. Why wasn't the Met Service able to provide good information, useful information to a variety of decision makers, and what could we do to try to move them up toward being a more helpful provider of information? We asked across this group of stakeholders for suggestions of possible first projects, and there was common agreement that helping farmers deal with drought would be a highly useful project. Jim Beiser is going to talk a little bit about the project itself, but I just wanted to tell you how we got to a drought product for farmers in Jamaica, and it ties all the way back up to the highest levels of national policy making. So what are climate services? It's a whole lot of things that roll together. It's the production of the data that we need, but it's not just the production and provision of data. It's translating it into terms and sort of a mindset that decision makers can use and understand so that they can make better decisions. It seems the production of services seems to work best when you have a collaboration between the user and the provider of the data, so that the provider really understands what the user is going to do with the information and can provide it in a way that will truly be useful. One of the problems that we find in developing countries is that they are expected to provide high quality products and services, but the Weather Service in a lot of countries is not the best funded agency in the government. And so they are working with limited resources. And when you talk with people across a government about, you ask the Met Service, why can't you provide more service? They say, well, we don't. One meteorologist in a country, and he or she is working at the airport because you have to have a meteorologist at an airport. So everybody else in the country is unserved. And you ask the Ministry of Finance or some of the other ministries, well, why aren't you supporting the Met Service? Well, they're not providing services that we need. Why would we give them a bigger budget if they're not helping us? So they get stuck in this vicious cycle of not having the resources to be useful and not demonstrating their usefulness to make the case for better resources. So in Jamaica and elsewhere, what we've tried to do is say, look, we'll help you make the first step up the graph by providing the resources so you can try to provide a first useful product to a powerful stakeholder group. In Jamaica's case, it was the Ministry of Agriculture. You demonstrate that you can provide a quality service, and then we or someone else will help you take the next resource step. So the idea is to sort of walk them up out of that basement, out of that cycle of not enough resources to provide good service, etc. I think we're making progress in Jamaica, and we're going to hear more about the value of the service that Jamaica Met Service pulled together in just a few minutes. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn for a little bit more detailed introduction to climate services and ways of evaluating them.
Okay, thank you, John. I think I'll stand too. Who's doing the clickers? Aha, I wonder. Okay, well, I'll try to use the clicker successfully. This is me. I'm an economist, and I've been working on climate services for the last few years. And my interest is not in the production of those services. We have a gang in the back that develop climate services and a lot of useful information. I'm mainly interested in how people take that information and apply it in their decision making and benefit from that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize climate services and look at the benefits. We use a value chain, which people are pretty familiar with in agriculture. We start out with the basic inputs, which include weather, climate, water, and in the case of Chris Bessenecker's presentation, the land as well. And we take that information and we look at observations, and through modeling and forecasting, we produce products, climate services, which we generally would think are important. And then we deliver those services, and this is a very key component on how you deliver those services. But climate services don't have value unless somebody takes them up and uses them, makes better decisions, and benefits from them. So what we do is we add to the service production user decisions and actions. And people, as John was indicating, people take that information, they interpret it or translate it into things that they understand, and then they apply it in making decisions. The one thing to keep in mind is that it's not just climate service information that goes into this decision making. And when Tahid and Jim talk, they'll mention some of the options that farmers considered in response to drought. So a key to having value is also having access to different options, being able to take advantage of information. And that is not just climate information, that's also other types of information. As a result of these decisions, you have outcomes, and with those outcomes comes value. And I'm an economist, and there's a few others, and we like to try to put a dollar amount to quantify those benefits. There's a lot of different users of climate services, and this is just a general case. And today, the two discussions that we'll have will focus on agriculture, on both farm production and pastoralist activities in Ethiopia and Tanzania. Why are we interested in valuing climate services? One is to help people make the economic case. And this is what you need to get up that step ladder that John showed to get to a level where you provide high quality services and the users can benefit from it. You can also use this information to inform awareness campaigns. If people are benefiting, it's nice to try to get more people to use it, to get more businesses to use the information if it's of quality and people are making good decisions. And also, imitation is very important. If you can demonstrate the benefits of these services in some countries, other countries may invest in them. And often, the closer the country is to one that has used the service, the easier it is for them to decide we can do that as well in our country. These are just some numbers from some studies that we've looked at, and you'll see we've actually picked a rather conservative set. But in general, the benefit cost ratio of most of the climate service work that's been done are pretty impressive.
It's been reported in the local paper, 30% decline in ag production during that period of 2013 to 2014, and an estimated $1 billion loss to the economy, not all in agriculture, some of it was fires, brush fires, etc. Well, as I mentioned, so the Jamaican Meteorological Society, working with the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, based at Columbia University, produced and then provided seasonal drought forecast information to over 300 farmers across Jamaica in a number of the parishes across Jamaica. And so after that happened over a period of a few months, nearly a year, anecdotal stories began to emerge that suggested that some of the losses in agricultural production would have been greater if not for the service. In other words, people reduced their losses as compared to farmers that were not using the information. And that's really the crux of this project and how we're going to communicate it to you. So anecdotal stories, but anecdotal evidence, it doesn't constitute real evidence, right, about economic impact. Important, stories are interesting, but stories plus data are really powerful, and that's what's behind our study. So what are the components of this drought information service? Okay, you can see on the top left-hand side a map. This map was produced by the Jamaica Meteorological Service. It is a drought forecast 3 months in advance, and is generally for Jamaica. So in collaboration with IRI, the JMS, the Jamaican Meteorological Service, produced this and made it available. The second component had to do with what was called farmers' forums. Farmers' forums are a gathering of farmers in a setting, day-long settings. 12 of them happened over the 2 years, 7 in 2014, 5 in 2015. They were convened by RADA and the Ag Extension Service. And then a third component is information dissemination, getting the information out. What primarily happened in the farmer forums was more of a capacity building, a training, and understanding of what is happening and what they would see in the dissemination. The dissemination came out in the form of text messages. 2014 and 2015, we looked at both of them separately for reasons of gestation of information. There's some interesting findings there. The people got the information through the extension offices, the RADA, and also there were some direct information requests, that is, people calling up the meteorological service and asking, hey, what's going to happen? The topics that we addressed. So we wanted to help try and determine household vulnerability. In other words, from farmer to farmer, what is it that makes one farmer more vulnerable to the drought than others? So economic vulnerability is particularly important. So do you have diversification in income? How much of your income is coming from agriculture versus perhaps other things? What are some of the constraints in agricultural decisions? So what are some of the things that affect your ability to have output? Is it financing? Is it water? Is it uncertainty about what's going to happen when it comes to the weather? And then access to climate information. These contribute to your access. Do you have a cell phone? Do you have a radio? Do you have TV? So that whole series of questions through our survey got to that. Then to determine the impact of drought on agricultural output, we want to see if drought actually affected the output. And then how did the information affect the production, the outcome, how much was produced? So how the climate service information, did it affect what people were able to produce? Then we looked at the impact of the information service on agriculture decisions. So what are some of the decisions? How did people actually change what they did? Did they change the timing? Did they change what they planted? Did they change when they harvested and things like that? And then finally, trying to determine the demand for climate information service. People really want this stuff, and in fact, how are they willing to pay for it? So we identified the information by comparing agricultural outcomes of farmers by degrees of exposure to information service. So how much were they exposed to any one of those 5 different components? And then comparing the distribution of the agricultural outcomes of these subgroups of the farmers, especially farmers that demonstrate that they really are uncertain about climate, weather, rainfall, and drought. We surveyed 453 households in 10 of Jamaica's 14 parishes. We did it through phone interviews. Problems with phone interviews, but we can get at that. But that, timing and resources had a lot to do with that. We incentivized them with some phone credits, so they would talk to us. We collected the data in August of 2015. Our outcome variable was that we really focused on was what is the percentage loss in agricultural production in 1 year after the drought compared to the year before. Dr. Rahman will get back at that, very important. So, and then this was all self-reported. The measuring the information service, actually, Tahid, I think I'm going to stop here and I'm out of time. If you don't mind, just start with this and you can go all the way through that.
Okay. Thank you, Jim, for my job since Jim set up it very beautifully. So how we do capture the climate information services, as Jim described, it had multiple components. So one of the component is climate forecast itself, that is the product. Second one is Farmers Forum, which is basically had multiple objectives, and you can think of it in a variety of ways. It is educational, it is capacity building, it is awareness and understanding about the climate information they might receive, how to perceive climate risk. So it's a lot of things. And then other one is information dissemination. So here what this slide is showing is that when we look at the impact of information service, the package of services which was provided on the loss, agricultural loss, production loss, how do we capture the climate services in our analytical work? One way we do it in 2 ways. First, we look at agricultural outcomes of different farmers, and we look at whether they participated in Farmers Forum or not, yes or no. Likewise, we do the same thing, their agricultural loss, distribution of agricultural loss, whether they received text messages about drought forecast in 2014. Same thing we do for 2015, and then there were some farmers who called Met Service to receive the information. So here what we do is, in first part of analysis, we look at each segment, component of climate information services, and then we try to see their effect on agricultural outcome. Then the second way we try to capture the climate services is we combine all. So there are some farmers, for example, if you look at that is what it is, exposure to information service. So basically here, there are some farmers who received climate information from all of these 5 components. They participated in Farmers Forum. They received text message in 2014, 15. They talked to, when they were making their agricultural decisions, now they knew the information is out there, forecast information is out there. They proactively contacted JMH. So the way we interpret exposure to information service is you get 0 if you don't participate in any of the component. That by de facto becomes our comparison group. These are the farmers who did not participate in information service. 1 means one of the component you participated. So ideally what happens is that if you get the 5, that means you have maximum exposure to the climate information services. So the intuition and rationale is that greater is exposure to the climate information service, your agricultural loss will be smaller. I mean, that is how we capture it. So what is the main findings? So the first thing is that we have a lot of, if you read the report, we have a lot of detailed analysis, what kind of farmers we are dealing with. So here, these 3 bullet points trying to convey that we are talking about farmers in Jamaica who are economically very vulnerable. Their livelihood is very vulnerable in 3 senses. One is over 60% of their household income comes from the agriculture. That is point 1. Second, within agriculture, those farmers who do agriculture as a primary means of their livelihood, the diversification of agriculture itself is very limited. That means majority of agriculture is concentrated for few agricultural crops. So that is so in general, these are very economically vulnerable farmers we are talking about, where there is a greater reliance on agricultural outcome for their livelihood. Second aspect of their vulnerability is that, okay, what is their challenges? Once we know that we are economically vulnerable farmers, what are the challenges to their management agricultural practices? So three most commonly reported challenge is, one is water, second one is access to finances, which could be many things. It could be savings, access to financial market, credit, loans, or whatever, your borrowing ability. The third one is, which is really important for the purpose of this analysis and our result, is that uncertainty of climate. What it means is water, rainfall. So farmers reported that uncertainty of how much water they are going to get, what will be drought condition, what will be rainfall condition over the next season or so. That was a big constraint to their ability to make a quality of decisions they want to make about the farming practices. So economically vulnerable farmers challenged by uncertainty of climate. These are our subject matters here, right? Who reported to have radio, TV, and agricultural extension as their primary means of receiving information. So these are the type of farmers we are dealing with, okay? Which is what it shows, if you ask me that summary, that it shows the farmers who are at risk of climate change and variability. This slide, what it is showing is impact of drought. So if you look at, I will not go in detail about it. So there are three ways we are trying to look at the impact of drought on agriculture. As Jim pointed out, that according to Ministry of Agriculture, the impact was 30% loss in agricultural income, and which amounted to more than $1 billion to the economy. We wanted to see whether that was the case in our sample of farmers. And what do we find is actually it is the case. In fact, our finding is that our farmers on average had greater loss. So there is a 31% decline in value of total agriculture output in between 2014 to 50 in 1 year period, which is consistent with what Ministry of Agriculture reported. The total loss in volume of agricultural production is 57%. Okay? So this is a drought, in fact, did have a devastating effect on the economy. So this is, so whatever news was there, that is true. So now, the real thing is, what is the impact of information service? Here we are talking about farmers whose average loss was 57% in terms of agricultural output. So our interest is, since climate services was provided, was the loss of the farmers who participated in our information service program, was their loss smaller than the farmers who did not? That is going to show the impact of information service. So in that sense, the first result is the farmers who identified uncertainty of water, rainfall, and drought as a constraint to their agricultural decisions, their loss in agricultural output was 25% larger than the average loss of the group. So uncertainty of climate did have an effect on the agricultural outcome. Second one is, but the result, this is the important result. For those farmers who reported uncertainty of climate to be a big challenge, if they received the climate information service, their loss was significantly lower. So what it means that climate information service did produce a significant positive effect on agricultural output of the farmers who identified lack of climate information as a problem. So what this result suggests that a climate information service meeting the demand of the people will have a significant economic impact. And that is what is happening in the remaining points. So remember, one thing, as Jim pointed out, and I also said about it, that climate information service had multiple components. Farmers Forum, text message in 2014, 15, extension offices, and calling. Among that, you might be interested which of the component was more effective. What we find is that Farmer Forum was utmost important. And that is reflected in the remaining 2 points. So the farmers who participated only in Farmers Forum, their loss was 19% lower than the average. if they participated in Farmers Forum, also received the text message in 2014, then their loss became 30% lower. So what it is suggesting is that participating in Farmers Forum and then being followed by the Drought Information Service forecast, it has a reinforcing effect, right? So it is basically multiple channel of information they are reconfirming, and you are more likely to adopt because you are receiving the information from multiple sources, and therefore it has an effect. So in summary, Climate Information Service did in fact have a very, very substantial effect. Now the question is, why did it do that? What was the mechanism? That slide brings, actually, so the way Climate Information Services produced positive economic outcome was by actually influencing the real agricultural decisions. So the farmers who received this information, they were able to change their planting and sowing time. That is 71% of the farmers said. They were able to change their types of crops, amount of land cultivated, harvesting time, mulching practices, and irrigation. So basically what this shows, these are the coping mechanisms that farmers adopted in response to Climate Information Service. So this shows us the mechanism through which actually the service produced the results. The last but not the least, the issue is that, okay, if it had a significant impact, did it have a demand? What we find in this slide is that actually it is true. 97% of the farmers say that yes, we would like to receive this kind of information in the future, and more importantly, 84% of them said they will be willing to pay for the service if it is good, timely, relevant climate information. This demonstrates 2 points. This reaffirms that information service had economic impact, right? And second, it shows what is the future demand. So in conclusion, and I will conclude, the drought in fact did have a significant effect on agricultural outcomes. Information service had a very substantial effect, but there is a very important caveat here. It was useful to those farmers who identified uncertainty of climate to be a problem. Why this result, as I am an economist, this result is really exciting to me because it is consistent with information theory. The idea of information theory is when you lack information, and when somebody provides information, the reason why it works because it helps you to deal with uncertainty and make better decisions, right? So that is one important. Farmers Forum was very critical. There is a strong demand for seasonal forecast information service. 1 second last. So the question is, beyond this project, what is the lessons for everything else, climate information services? The one lesson is that climate information services must be demand driven. Where this result comes from? It comes from the fact that in our result shows that climate services information service was really useful to the farmers who identified uncertainty of climate to be a challenge. So what it means is that when you are responding to a specific demands of a farmer, that product is likely to be used, and if it is likely to be used, it is going to have an economic impact. The second lesson is that most often, second lesson is most often climate information services do many things. All good, well-intentioned. There is nothing wrong in that per se. For example, in our case, climate information was disseminated through multiple channels. Multiple organizations are involved. So there is nothing wrong in that because our results showed that they are reinforcing each other. The effect is reinforcing. But it is a problematic from one point of view. Let's say if you ask us, how do you infer, what are the lessons you infer from your Jamaican experience for the climate information service programming in another country? Can you say that you want to do the same exactly all 5 components, Farmers Forum and everything? We don't know, we can't say it. Why? Because when you do multiple things, it is very difficult to isolate and attribute the contribution of each component, which one was more effective, which was not. So the future lesson is that when you think about climate information services, probably you want to think more systematically about what you do, each component and each aspect of it, and you set up a kind of design which will allow you to have a more rigorous impact evaluation.
Indigenous knowledge has become increasingly unreliable for these pastoralists. As a consequence, they're relying more on scouts, but scouts are very resource and time intensive. The big question for us is, what is the impact? What is the impact on mortality? We've expanded this project, and so we've done a baseline survey in both Tanzania and in Ethiopia. And before I get to that, let me talk about pastoralism in general in terms of the significance on the continent. In Ethiopia, there's approximately 6.6 million pastoralists, agro-pastoralists. In Tanzania, depending on who you talk to, it's anywhere from 3 to 12 million. Across the continent, we're talking about 250 million people that rely on pastoralism as a livelihood. So as I was saying, we wanted to know what's the impact of this process of grazing and decision making. This is our most recent baseline that was done in October, and what we found was the average herd mortality over the last 3 years was 40%. There was a big peak in mortality this past year due to the ongoing drought there, so it's raised that average up a bit. This is the typical composition of a herd: camel, cattle, sheep, and goat. And this is roughly the proportion. The X is sort of represents the percentage of each species and their mortality. In Tanzania, roughly 1/4 of their herd will die over the course of the year. And again, this is sort of the proportionality. This is a Maasai area, so it's very cattle dependent. So what does this mean in terms of value? It's quite mind-boggling. When you look at the average value of that herd loss, average local market value of that herd loss in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, it's close to 4,000. In Tanzania, it was over 5,000 per household. If you look at the typical pastoral community population size, this represents about $22 million in losses for the average wareda, which is the administrative, the equivalent to a county in Ethiopia. In Tanzania, they use districts, and they're a bit larger, and so the loss for a given district, pastoral district, would be about $76 million. If you project and assume that the losses that we were seeing in our baseline are applicable to the entire pastoral population in both of these countries, you're talking about billions of dollars in losses to the economy each year. It's quite staggering. The challenge is that we have a livelihood that's quickly deteriorating, and our conventional approach to dealing with this isn't working. We've set up an emergency response apparatus to deal with drought-related effects that has been primarily designed to prevent famine, and it's not really designed to address the ongoing needs that pastoralists have. We wanted to test a conventional wisdom, and that wisdom is that if pastoralists can't find pasture, it's because it doesn't exist. When I met that pastoralist back in 2006, that very morning I was looking at some data by FuseNet that had satellite data, and it was for the country as a whole. And it challenged me to think, is there a way that we could take that information and condense it and make it accessible to that pastoralist in the field that I met? This picture is a picture of Meteosat-10. It's a European weather satellite. It's a geostationary satellite that sits about 23,000 miles above North Africa. And it's basically a big camera. It takes pictures every 15 minutes, both visual and infrared. And from that imagery, what we can create is something called NDVI, which is Normalized Differential Vegetation Index, which is kind of a fancy word for saying photosynthesis. It's a measure of photosynthesis. It's been around for decades. It's proven to be a very reliable value, but it's mostly used by governments. It's used by the same governments that do the early warning triggering. So what we wanted to do was to see if we could take this information and make it applicable to a pastoralist in a given area for their traditional grazing grounds. And that's essentially what SAPARM is. It's a 4-step process. The first step is going into the community, and over a course of 2 or 3 meetings, we map with them. We start out with asking them what's the extent of their traditional grazing grounds, what's the farthest north, south, east, and west you go. Based on that, we come back with a large-scale topographical map, sit down with representatives from the entire war area, and they sit and they discuss and they map out their traditional grazing grounds. Step 2 is the satellite. It's up there 24/7 taking pictures. It's that satellite has a real cost and real value, but for us, it's free information. And so we can gather that free information, and with the community mapping, and this is step 3, we fuse those 2 pieces together to create these localized vegetation maps. And we use a platform in Ethiopia that WFP developed called LEAP. From that point forward, it becomes automated. These maps are generated every 10 days with the most recent value of vegetation. And a real distinction between farmers and pastoralists that's important to note is, farmers are interested in forecasts, but pastoralists are interested in what's going on right now. They need to feed their animals. They need to provide their animals with water now. So their interest isn't in the next 3 months and what the rainfall is going to be. They're interested in where they can feed their animals now, and that's what SAPARM provides them with. So this information is automated every 10 days, and it's auto-emailed, in this case, to PCI. And then the manual distribution process begins. So we work with the administrative officials and create a protocol for distribution down to the community level. And in our proof of concept in 2013, what this amounted to was about 1 map for every 120 households. Over the course of the dry season, and that was about, for that one particular war area, that was amounted to about a ream of paper that we distributed. So the cost, because of the automation, because the information is free to us from the satellite, the cost of this innovation is really low. This is what a SAPARM map looks like. This is actually a map, and one of the new districts that we're working with in Tanzania. Just to give you some reference to the map, the black line is the perimeter of the district, and the red dotted lines are those traditional grazing areas that the pastoralists have mapped. Around that area, it's whited out, and we do that intentionally because we don't want pastoralists to be going to places where they shouldn't go. These are the traditional grazing grounds. These were discussed with both pastoral and host communities and confirmed. So this is where we want them to be and where we want them to have information about where to go. Question invariably comes up is, well, if all pastoralists are moving to one area, don't you risk overgrazing? It's this tragedy of the commons concept. And what we found is that it really isn't in play here. Just because an area is green on a map isn't a license to go there. And pastoralists in both Tanzania and Ethiopia have very specific customary law of reciprocity, and that reciprocity is conditional. So if I go to a certain area, I don't just come and bring my animals. I meet with the local leadership. They ask me questions about number of animals, how long are you going to stay, if my animals are sick. They establish terms for grazing. There's areas that are off limits, and if you go to those areas, there's a fine, there's a consequence. And so this is practice has been in play for really centuries in both countries, and it's worked quite well. It's not to say that overgrazing doesn't happen, but there are other pressures that create overgrazing. In fact, what we found with SAPARM is pastoralists are actually finding it to be a benefit to management. Because before, you'd walk your animals up to an area where you hoped would be good grazing. You find that the grass is substandard, but you've already walked your animals there, so they're gonna eat it anyway. So with SAPARM, they can allow those grounds to lay fallow and regenerate and go to the areas that are more productive. The other thing that we found recently is that the local governments are now using the maps to predict where pastoralists are moving, and that's where they're going to provide immunization services. So in our proof of concept, this was in 2013, we looked at what were the results. And what we found was that close to 80% of the pastoralists were using the maps for migration decision making. Again, in combination, and there was this positive reinforcement between the maps, scouts, and Dagu, where now you could be very specific about where you send the scouts. Or now the information going into the oral communication system was informed by the maps. One of the things that was most surprising was that after that one season of intervention, more than half of the pastoralists said that these maps were now their most important source for migration decision making. But ultimately, what we were interested in, would this have any impact on mortality? And what we found was a precipitous drop in mortality amongst all species of animals. It was a 48% decline, and that decline had major value. And I'm going to let Jennifer take it from here.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't think we have tons of time left, so I'm going to breeze through this a little quickly. But we wanted to see what that 48% decline looked like in terms of value for the pastoralist. So we looked at the decline in mortality against the market value of those animals and came out with $8 million, less the market value of our control group of their reduction in herd loss. And so that gives us a net of $5.4 million. And our costs, we took the entire cost of our proof of concept grant, as well as the World Food Programme's digitization efforts, and the government of Ethiopia's estimated time that it took for them to distribute these maps, and came out with a total cost of $115,000. So our net present value then was $5.3 million. And that gives us a benefit cost ratio of 47 to 1. Now, looking at this against other interventions that address high mortality rates in pastoralism, we looked at food aid, destocking, supplemental feed, and restocking. What's important to note is that food aid accounts for about 80% of the $500 million US dollars that go to drought assistance in Ethiopia alone. So we addressed World Food Programme and asked them to give us an estimated cost of what it took to give food assistance to a family in Ethiopia for 6 months. And that was accounted for $660 per household. And that only amounts for about 1/5 the value of the loss in herd mortality. So SAPARM really stands up against all these other cost-benefit ratios to be the highest. Destocking comes close, but what's important to note about destocking and really all these other interventions is that they're triggered by early warning, and they're pretty resource intensive and labor intensive. And so they're narrow in focus and only for a certain period of time, whereas SAPARM is continuous and ongoing for the pastoralists throughout the year. So what's also special and unique about SAPARM is that a lot of the costs are upfront. So in our proof of concept, that's where the cost has been highest in this stage 1. We're currently in stage 2 and already seeing the cost go down. So the mapping is our main cost, and that's up front. And the monitoring evaluation was also included in our costs, but that won't be at scale. So as we scale this project, the cost per beneficiary can go down to, we're estimating 28 cents per beneficiary per year. Now, actually, with our newest baseline that just came in from our expanded testing, it could be as low as about 12 cents per beneficiary if you just look at true cost of mapping, and also servers and things if we want to distribute this. So our randomized controlled trial in Ethiopia is about 16 communities, and we have all the communities in purple are our control versus the green, which are intervention. And in Tanzania, the purple is our comparison, and then the two communities are our intervention communities there. And in each of these communities, we're not just testing the usefulness of the map, but also our dissemination methods. So channel 1 is our dissemination method from our proof of concept, which used the emailed maps to PCI, and then we distributed those to the local district or WAREDA official, and so on and so forth. Channel 2, we're testing what it's like to bypass PCI altogether in government offices in which there is infrastructure for printers and computers. And channel 3 is ultimately where we see SAPARM at scale. And that would be bypassing this entire dissemination process altogether and putting the maps directly in the hands of the pastoralist, who is the decision maker. And so as broadband and 3G expand rapidly and smartphones outpace feature phones by 2020, as GSMA predicts, we want to be ready. And we want to have SAPARM be something that is for decision-making and use and management, these climate services, directly by the pastoralists rather than the government. And it also, the benefit of this is that if we put it on a mobile platform, it's also making ICT, or information communication technology, useful and relevant for the daily life of these pastoralists. And so at scale, this looks like the dark blue shaded countries where pastoralism is a large percent of the population and can represent up to 40% of the GDP and 44% of the total area landmass on the continent. And we just wanted to end with a testimonial of one of our pastoralists in Ethiopia here, and I think it's question round next, and I'll hand it back to John for that.
And so we have some questions from the online audience. First, we're just going to make sure that the microphone is working. Okay. Let me start with a quick question from the audience. I'm going to give this to Chris while we work out the technical details. Well, Chris or Jen, why is indigenous knowledge considered unreliable?
Well, because what's happening is the ecologies in these communities are changing. It used to be that if winds blew a certain way, or there were certain methods that you used to determine where pasture was going to be and whether or not that's going to be good. With climate change and the shifting in the rain patterns, that's no longer predictable anymore. And so what pastoralists are finding is that these traditional methods aren't working like they used to. And what we've said is that indigenous knowledge is still critically important, but it's how you combine it with, in this case, satellite technology. So for example, what SAPARM will tell you is it will tell you this is an area where vegetation is good, but what it won't tell you is, is that farmland? Is that prosopis, a weed that grows in that area? Indigenous knowledge is still important to understand those areas. And as we were mentioning, SAPARM doesn't take the place of all of the traditional agreements and processes and customs that go on. Those are still really important. So we don't see SAPARM as a replacement of indigenous knowledge, even with its inherent weakness in this time of climate change.
I think I'll just toggle back and forth between people in the room and people online. So I'll start with Walter. If you could introduce yourself, speak right into the mic.
Okay. Rodolfo Camacho from Abt Associates. We saw two examples focused on drought today, and I just wanted to know if there are good studies on benefit cost analysis for climate services focusing on flooding. And I guess given the fact that it takes a while to recover from flooding, and it not only affects agriculture by multiple sectors in the landscape.
Yes, there are certainly a lot of studies. The book that I mentioned has we looked at almost 180 studies, went through the literature, and quite a few of them concern flooding. And the big issue with flooding is just adding additional time to the warning. That if people have 2 days instead of 1 day, it gives them better time to prepare, and particularly to move some infrastructure, or if you're a farmer, to move animals to higher ground or to find safety. And so the benefits of flooding are to infrastructure, loss of life, which is a big issue, particularly in areas with typhoons and that. And in the Philippines, they've had a major problem with that, not being able to get people out of the way of a massive amount of flooding. There are not enough of those flooding studies in developing countries, however.
Can you repeat that?
The question was, would you expect larger benefit cost ratios for flooding? I think it's very site specific. In some areas, you can expect very large benefits. Again, the major problem you're going to run into, which we as economists struggle with, is how are you going to value life? And the value of a statistical life is one of the most controversial areas of benefit cost analysis, and something that EPA struggled with in the United States and other countries as well. Something that no one really feels very comfortable with, except economists, of course.
Just a quick input on the benefit cost question. I'm Bill Ward from USAID. I'll pass on to you something that my old friend, the late Walt Spofford, told me 20 years ago. With benefit cost analysis, when you first enter an area and you begin doing public interventions, of course you have very high benefit cost ratios. Simple economic principles. There's a lot out there that hasn't been done yet. That's the first thing. And this was very clear when we first started doing the air and water work in the U.S. in the 1960s. Second thing Walt said is, you need to understand the political process of actually doing the things you're trying to do. You don't need to show all those benefits you can calculate, but somebody will question them. So a 47-to-1 benefit cost ratio might be true and correct, but in that 47, there will be some things that some people will question. So politically, you're better off early in the process to just focus on those things that nobody will disagree with. And when you show a 5-to-1 benefit cost ratio, that's fantastic.
So one more online, and then I'll hand it over to Eric. I think this is for Tauhid. How do you deal with farmers who receive secondary access to the information services? How do you control for that, and how much does it matter?
So this is really a very interesting question, and thank you for asking. The way we do is that, if you remember, that the way we capture participation in information service is one of the measure is degree to exposure. So it takes a value between 0, 1, 2, 5. When it is 0, these are the farmers who received information from secondary sources. So in a way, our result is not a comparison of people who had 0 access to information from whatever sources versus our access to information from climate information services. Our result is about the difference in agricultural outcome of the farmers who directly participated in climate information service that was provided versus farmers who might have received information indirectly from other sources. Now, then you will be wondering why there is an effect then? Because everybody had a difference. The reason why you have an effect is, that's why I mentioned that Farmers Forum was very important. Everybody knows, and all of you know better than me and Jim, about that it is not just about the information per se. It is about whether you are able to process it, internalize it, and implement it, right? Act upon it. So climate information is there in a variety of forms, variety of ways, but what this climate information service did is that during the Farmers Forum, you have a multiple organization, Egg Ministry, Extension Services, ACDI, IVOCA, JMH. You are educating, training the farmers. So now what you have done by doing that, you have built the capacity of the farmers to act upon the information they receive. So that is, I think, one of the mechanisms through which the effect is being produced. Yeah.
This is a really important point, and it goes back to doing really good baseline analysis to find out who is providing information. We had a project in Kazakhstan where there were 2 government research centers in 2 of the wheat growing regions, but in the 3rd region, there was a single corporate farmer who took it upon himself to do his own farm days every spring. And he would invite the farmers from other farms to see his farm and talk about what he was going to plant for that season, what kinds of chemicals he was going to use, what seeds he was going to use, what technologies, and talk about where the markets are. And so if you went in and said the only information that's provided is government information, you might miss a really valuable source of information.
Yes. Eric Hyman, USAID Economic Policy Office. Yes, Eric Hyman, USAID Economic Policy Office, and I manage the CEADIR project. I've got a couple of questions and comments for each of you. First, Glenn, you had mentioned some training materials on value net services. Can you let people know where they're available? And I'll just go through all the questions first. Okay. And then on the issue of flooding, I think a lot of it depends on whether it's urban versus rural. Urban infrastructure damages can be quite costly. On the benefit cost issue, it's also actually we should be valuing the costs that are incurred by the farmers and the pastoralists to respond to the information. If they're changing agricultural inputs or adding irrigation, these can be quite costly. That could change the numbers considerably. And I wanted to check whether discounting for the time value of money had been incorporated in these various studies that have been mentioned.
So I'll just say really briefly, our study was a 1-year study, proof of concept, so there was no discounting. It was just a 1-year time horizon. We're now doing a 3-year program, so we have a randomized control trial, and we're going to be looking at that issue for those 3 years and possibly beyond that with some discounting involved.
When you want to comment on the
Yes, the training materials are, there's a link to the training materials in a document called a Compendium for the Climate Change Resilient Development Project. And you can go to USAID's Climate Links site, and you can download the compendium there, and you can actually access the training materials. There were 3 training workshops that were held in the Caribbean, Africa, and Southern Europe. And all of those materials are there, and there's both presentations and there's exercises that we used with the participants in that.
And we will, when this ends, we'll add the link to the online thing. So any of you who want to listen again, that are in the room, you can do that, but we'll post it online. And let me say, some of the questions that came in from the webinar audience are fairly technical, so it might take quite a long time to answer. In fact, I think one of them might take a semester. So what we'll do is give the questions to the speakers and see if we can get email answers for some of them. I want to go over here, and then I'll come back to the webinar.
Hi, I'm Jared Mason, also from the Office of Economic Policy at USAID. You can tell that your presentation brought all of the USAID economists out of the woodwork. So it's very interesting. Thank you. I have a question for each of the teams, actually. So on the Jamaica Meteorological Service project, it seems like, I mean, you didn't mention anything about randomness in selecting farmers, and given that it's a small population, I'm curious, how do you distinguish between the effect of the information that you're getting and the effect of just having farmers that are kind of more entrepreneurial? I'm thinking particularly if the effect of the farmer training days or the farmer groups or however you called them is really significant. That might just be that people who are more willing to go to a day-long training are also more interested in being responsive to some of these bigger issues in terms of, you know, adjusting their crop timing and what they're planting and whatnot. So how do you disentangle that effect? I think is a really important question.
Yeah.
And then, sorry, I'll just ask them a question too, and then for the pastoralist project, given that the current iteration of the project works through kind of the existing political economy of those communities, number one, are you concerned about kind of the political economy aspects of providing information from kind of a top-down method? And number two, if your ultimate kind of idea is to provide directly to the pastoralist, does this undercut existing kind of social structures that that have a kind of a power dimension? And does that provide any? Do you have any concerns about that in a broader context in the future?
So let me answer. So one thing before this is excellent question. I mean, as an economist, this is the first impulse reaction to when you look at impact of any climate information service. So before I answer, I want to just we missed our co-author Jackery Guido, who is not here, and Jim and I are presenting it, but without him, this work would not have been possible. So I want to mention that he's there. So this is, as I said, it is an excellent question because self-selection, participation in any program always has a always question is self-selection. Are the people who are participating in program in some way systematically different from the people who are not? So for example, his question, as he suggests, that it could be the people who participated in Farmers Forum, they may be more vulnerable to climate change and drought, or more prepared, more proactive. It could go in either direction. Then in that case, whatever the results you find, you cannot generalize it to the other farmers. So what we did was, actually in our case, there is no self-selection problem. We tested it. And so if you look at the report, the first thing before we go and document the impact, we try to see is there any selection bias or not. So we don't have selection problem. And why we don't have? Because it makes sense. So generally in Farmers Forum, what happened in 10 parishes of Jamaica, RADA, which is Ministry of Agriculture Extension Offices, they were delegated to mobilize the farmers. So for each Farmers Forum, they were located in different part of Jamaica. The target was 50 farmers to attend it. That is what they were planning to attend it. And so local extension officers went to the farmers, different communities, announced it that the Farmers Forum will be gone. This will be the purpose of it. And so what we did was, in our analysis, we wanted to see the farmers who participated in Farmers Forum, are they different from the farmers who did not participate in Farmers Forum? We do not find it. So actually, we don't have selection problem. Now, this is to the extent that observable characteristics we see. Farmers can differ in terms of their perception of risk, other things which we can't absorb. So in that sense, we can't say. But as far as observable characteristics are concerned, there is no self-selection problem. So this result is generalizable.
Sure. So there were two questions. One was whether we're concerned that this is a top-down approach. I would say that it's top-down only in the sense that information is coming literally top-down from the satellite.
That's good.
And that's just a mechanism of the logistics that exists. It's actually quite the opposite in terms of decision making. Typically, what happens is information. The government, central government, will dispatch people out to go do some ground truthing over the course of months as the drought gets worse and worse. And they'll take information from satellites, and a decision will be made in Addis or somewhere, not in that community. And the community is really just reliant on the government making some decision. SAPARM really changes the paradigm, because what it does is it puts this information in the hands of pastoralists, and they're the ones making the decision. So even though a government official in a Wareda passes the maps down to a Kibele level official who then passes it down to the village leader, they're not making any decision for that pastoralist. It's the pastoralist who's using that bird's eye view of their area and making decisions based on that. So in that way, it's really a bottom-up process. With regard to your second question about how might this change the dynamic of decision making or the culture of leadership within a community? I think it's a really good question, and the short answer is we don't really know yet. But what we do know is that pastoralists are really clamoring for this information, and when we first come in to talk about it, they get it. They get it very quickly, and there is a really almost critical demand for this kind of information. And there's a real excitement in these communities when they finally get the end product and see the map, because this is the kind of thing that they don't have now. When we talk about these grazing areas, and I didn't really have time to explain on the maps, each one of those pixels is about 10 square kilometers. And so we're talking about thousands and thousands of square kilometers of traditional grazing area. You might be able to send a scout out to one area or a few areas, but there's no way that you can cover those thousands of square kilometers every 10 days and understand what's going on. And that's the real power of SAPARM.
I'm going to take a couple from online. One quick one for Chris. Are there linkages to other USAID or USGS projects using NDVI in West Africa?
In West Africa, we are working not with a USAID project, but with a Dutch organization, SNB, who had heard about what we were doing in Ethiopia, and we're actually partnering with them on a project in Mali. In Mali, they're using a kind of a different model. They're using a telco process where the telco has a service center. Pastoralists will call in. That service center will have something akin to the SAPARM map, as well as other information, and provide that information. And we're really interested to see how that approach works. There's some advantages, and then there's some barriers, because now you have a third person interpreting that information for you. But we're excited to be a part of that project as well.
And one more. How do you organize or build climate services? What are the steps? How do you mobilize funds to build such a system, and who will pay to put the system in place? And I'll start with an answer. There's a very nice paper on the Climate Service Partnership webpage. It's climate-services.org. It was written by Steve Zibiak, mostly, who used to be at IRI. And it kind of lays out what some of the qualities you'd like to see in a climate service, and some of the things you need to look for in that, and how to organize it. I would imagine that Glenn's book has at least lessons you might glean, and then I'll see if anybody else wants to answer as well. And then we'll take probably just one or two more from the audience, and then we can wrap up.
The book, we've used what we call a 10-step process for designing benefit studies. And it starts out with thinking about what is the product, and also what is your motivation for doing a study. Is there a policy decision or a financial decision that you're trying to inform? Are you trying to create just more information for awareness campaigns? But it's very important to know what the reason for doing the study is, because that later on, as you get further into deciding what methodologies you're going to use to do your estimates, will become important. If there's serious money online, you'll need more precision in the benefit cost study that you do. If you're trying to generally show what the benefits are of using the service for an awareness campaign, you might take a different approach. But it's structured to take a designer through the process of articulating the problem they want to look at, and then looking at the different economic methods that could be used to do the benefit cost analysis. And it covers things like dealing with risk and uncertainty, and we also, there's 9 or 10 really detailed case studies of benefit studies in the back of the book. And then we can also put you in touch with a larger article that has very detailed discussions of over 140 studies.
And then on building a service itself, I would suggest looking at the WMO's Global Framework for Climate Services. They may have some information, and then I don't want to call out an audience member, but I will because I think she's still on there. Jackie Spence from the Jamaica Met Service might have some lessons as they've made, I think, a very positive pivot from being a fairly overwhelmed Met Service to beginning to try to provide targeted services. And so if you guys can text Jack and see what she has to say. Do you have any answer?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's a complicated question that would require, I think, a complicated answer, lots of components. So I'll just hit on one. And because Tahid had to rush through sort of his last slide, I'm just going to emphasize one point there, and it has to do with baseline. So if you take a look at our report, it's pretty academic, but it's got a lot of good lessons in it. In fact, it took, I think, 2 weeks to analyze the data because we were in a hurry to get our initial report out. But then we spent the next 3 months, Tahid running through absolutely every test he could at it to try and blow up our answers because we wanted them to be credible. And so credible, solid, unbiased evaluations that are based on a baseline that is part of it in order for the climate service actually, or our information to be credible. How did we, why would we consider ourselves unbiased in our evaluation? And something that didn't come out yet today. 3 points. Those who did the evaluation were not involved in the production or provision of the information. We just weren't part of it, hardly knew it was happening. We didn't ask farmers in our surveys whether or not they used the drought tool explicitly. We didn't say anything about a drought service or climate service. We asked them questions about information, per se. So what happens is that if you're surveying people, anyone that's done these knows that the interviewee often wants to give the answer that the interviewer wants to hear. We wanted to make sure that that wasn't happening. The third and last point on this one is that we really had no knowledge what kind of forecast information was part of the service. And, in fact, we didn't know even whether or not there was any skill there. So we truly came into this without having a prior understanding. And so everything that we wrote about in the report, and I'd encourage people to take a look at it, we'll make it available, it reflects that kind of thing. And this is really to your question, Jared.
We have time for one more. You guys in your hand the longest. Maybe grab the 40 back there.
Yes. Hi, my name is David Bonauda with Pact. I had a question regarding the Tanzania specific approach. In the case of Tanzania, from what I understand, the government of Tanzania's policies are very much stacked against pastoralists versus agriculturalists and wildlife management, particularly in the case up in the north in Monduli and Longido and Ngongoro. How will that dictate how much the take-up of this innovation will be for the government? Yeah. Do you foresee that being an issue, a barrier? It talks to this political economy issue, as well as could it be a tool to show that actually the human-wildlife conflicts can be mitigated by providing this map to the communities? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're very correct in that historically there's been sort of a position by the government that pastoralism is kind of an antiquated livelihood and inconsistent with wildlife management. I think there have been some studies that have really kind of disproven that, but nonetheless the pressures are still there. We've engaged the government very early on in the process, the Ministry of Livestock, and they're actually quite excited about it. One of the unique elements of SAPARM is that we could take those off-limits areas and wipe them out. So in effect, it helps to reinforce the government's desire to create an area that's off-limits. At the same time, some pastoral advocates that that are often at odds with the government are really excited because what they can do is show over a series of decades that they can physically go and show this is what's happening. These are their grazing areas. And this has never been done before. These traditional areas that are outside of the district have never really been mapped before. And so now they can actually show them, here are the corridors. This is how these pastoralists need to get to this area. And this is what's happening. And so their hope is that they could use this as an advocacy tool with the government.
I think we need to wrap up. I want to make a pitch for another discussion this afternoon that will also be online. You can learn about it on the Climate Links webpage. It's going to be Jim and Tahid talking just about the